Berry True Crime fans, how are you all today? Thank you very much for coming to this video. We are actually going to be going back to the UK. I did say I was going to do more international cases, and I will, but this case I really wanted to just get it done. This case would be playing on my mind for a long time if I don't do it now. This is the case of Sharon Birchwood. Sharon Birchwood lived in a place called Harriet's Lane in Ashted, Surrey, and she was 52 years old at the time of her murder. Harriet's Lane is a very affluent, very well-to-do place. Houses are worth around £500,000-ish. Sharon had her own little bungalow right in that area. Her sister Lauren, with whom Sharon was extremely close, they were described as being best friends, not just sisters. Lauren actually lived in the house in which Sharon and her grew up, and they saw each other very, very regularly. They were very, very close. Sharon was described as the kindest, loveliest, bubbliest, really warm and generous person that anyone could ever meet. She did not have a bad bone in her body. She never said anything bad about anybody. She was always happy and smiling. She was very gregarious. She had a way of making friends and keeping those friends close. She never abandoned anybody. She never sort of outgrew anybody. She always kept people close around her, never making an enemy of anybody. Sharon suffered from a condition called ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, but this never ever got her down. She never complained about it. She walked with a cane, but she was very, very capable of doing things for herself. She would go out shopping on her own. She would take a trolley with a wheel. When Sharon was in her early 20s, in the 1970s, she met a man called Graham George Birchwood, who always went by the name of George. They fell in love and married in the late 70s. However, between 87 and 89, they split up and they divorced sometime in the mid-90s. George went on to remarry, but at the time of Sharon's murder, he was actually single again and living at home with his mother. So they divorced around 8 years or so after they split, 7 or 8 years. However, now this was very interesting to note, Sharon didn't tell anybody. He went on and remarried, but she never told anybody that they had actually divorced. She didn't even tell her own sister. She still considered George to be her husband. She wanted him back. They stayed very, very close. As I said, Sharon was someone who loved people. She wanted that love. She wanted that companionship. She never got over George. She wanted to keep him close, and he did stay in her life right up until the point of her death. And she always harbored that hope that there would be a reconciliation or that they would remarry. George even described them as being best friends and saying that even though their marriage ended, it didn't actually end. The relationship always stayed the same. I don't know how that worked with him being remarried and everything. They didn't have any children together, so there was nothing actually binding them. They weren't obliged to stay in contact with one another. They could have easily just gone their separate ways. And George lived around 7 miles away in a place called Epsom. George visited Sharon several times a week. Lauren, Sharon's sister, often said it was almost every day. On the 7th of December 2007, 55-year-old George Birchwood visited his wife as he normally would every few days or every other day. He had a key to the house, so he let himself in, but he couldn't see Sharon anywhere. He walked around the property trying to find her and eventually found himself in Sharon's bedroom. And when he looked at the bed, he got a really bad feeling. On Sharon's bed was a big pile of clothing, and underneath that clothing was Sharon's dead body. Her wrists and her ankles were very tightly bound with parcel tape. She was still fully clothed. There was a gag in her mouth and electrical cord wrapped around her neck. George called 999 and police arrived on the scene with an ambulance. However, it was clear that Sharon had been dead for seemingly quite some time. George was very clearly distraught, but he was more than happy to help the police in any inquiry that he had. He was the first person to discover his ex-wife dead. So of course the police need to interview him straight away. He is the closest thing they have to a witness. In addition, he was still really, really close to Sharon, and she did have quite a lot of close friends, and there was her sister, there was her mother, there were her neighbours, but George looked like he could be the key to finding out who Sharon was. And this is something the police do. They try and find out as much as they can about a victim, because if they can unpack the victim's life, it can often shed light on exactly what had happened to them. Everybody in Sharon's life, including George, attested to Sharon's kind and caring nature. And George was quoted as saying, "Nobody hates her, she's not that type at all." Now, this was really difficult for police. A woman who didn't make enemies, she had no criminal history, she had no links with any kind of rings or anyone of a corrupt or criminal nature. It didn't seem to be that the reason for this crime was obvious at all. There were three things that were very, very problematic for the police. The first one, of course, was the motive, as we've already said. The second one was the time of death. And the third one was, of course, any clues as to who this killer might be and why they had killed Sharon. It was often described as a tangled web that the police had to untangle and make sense of. It seemed so strange that a woman who was just so well loved by everybody was trussed up and killed in this very cold manner. It really had the police scratching their heads. They had no idea as to who would want Sharon dead. With the time of death, this was going to be very problematic because the pathologist would examine the body to determine the rate of rigor mortis. But the problem is that Sharon's body had been covered in a huge mound, and I mean a lot of clothing, piled right on top of her. So her body temperature would have plummeted, not at the same rate that you would expect a human corpse to go cold. They go cold very, very quickly, and that is something that the pathologists look for. However, this would have meant that Sharon's body cooled at a much slower rate, throwing off her time of death, confusing it by around 24 hours potentially. Therefore, they couldn't pinpoint the definitive time or date of death. Sharon was found on the 7th of December. It's clear she'd been dead probably for maybe 1 or 2 days, but they couldn't be 100% sure. She could have died any time in that last 4 days, around about. We're going to return to the time of death in a moment. That is a very crucial part of this case. But the other issue was that there was a massive problem with the crime scene. Sharon Birchwood was, as her sister described, a hoarder. She was someone who collected everything, every record of her day, every single ticket or receipt or invoice or letter, anything at all. Her house wasn't really that well organized. There weren't files or anything like that. She wasn't very good at keeping things in order. Things were piled everywhere. She didn't like throwing things away. One thing that the police did consider, that maybe this was a robbery gone wrong, but why would you go to such huge lengths to kill somebody if you're just going to rob them? And it wasn't obvious that anything had really been taken. A lot of people who knew Sharon knew that her house was never really that tidy. And even George said it looks like the murder was frenzied, but he couldn't see that anything had been ransacked in the hope of finding something. But again, why would a burglar go to those huge lengths to kill someone? If they needed to get out of there, they would probably just knock somebody out cold and leg it. There was also no sign of entry. There was no violence used at all. So whoever it was probably either picked the lock. They can find out if somebody had, but I'm not sure if they actually did do any tests on that, but there was clearly no sign of a break-in. So whoever did this could either had a key made or they picked the lock. It was very, very hard for forensics to determine what items in the home were relevant to the murder and what was not relevant to the murder. The only thing they knew for certain is that the items on Sharon's person, like the tape and the cord and the gag, they were real proper pieces of evidence, and they were secured at the time of Sharon's autopsy. DCI Maria Woodall was the woman responsible for heading up the investigation into the disappearance and eventual murder of Millie Dowler. She solved that murder, and she was in charge of the murder of Sharon Birchwood now. She headed up a team that did everything they could. They went out and they interviewed everybody in that area. They handed out 6,000 leaflets to businesses and people in the area, and that actually yielded a massive response. People were coming through saying they'd seen Sharon on this day and on that day, and through all of these witness testimonies and CCTV footage that showed that Sharon had actually been shopping in Guildford in Surrey on the 4th of December, indicated that this may have been the day she died. Some people who suffer with ME undergo cognitive behavioural therapy and other treatments to help organise their lives a lot more, because chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME, can sometimes make someone more forgetful, or there may be times where the ME is flared up, or that they're just not in a position to do something, so they have to rearrange and reorganize their lives. Now, it seemed that this is what Sharon did. She would really keep extensive records of where she'd been, what she'd done, and she would also plan what she was going to do days and weeks in advance. She also would tick off everything she would do in her diary as she was doing it. So it wasn't like an end of the day, have I done this or that? She literally would go as she went, bit by bit. And she would write down what she was going to watch on television as well. So she never missed anything. The way that her house looked to someone who would just walk in didn't look very organized. But actually she was, in her mind, she was very organised. She was very, very good at planning. Coupled with the testimony of people saying that they had seen Sharon in Guildford on the 4th of December and the CCTV footage, as well as Sharon's diaries, showed that the 4th of December was more than likely the day that she had died. Sharon had ticked off on that day one thing she did. I don't quite know what that was, but it was something that she had meant to do first thing in the morning. There were other things that she had noted on her diary, one of which was going shopping in Guildford, that hadn't been ticked off. Meanwhile, while all this investigation was going on, we will return to that, the police were interviewing Graham Birchwood, and they were interviewing so many different people, but Graham was seen as very key to the investigation because he was the one who discovered the body. And one of the police officers said, look, you're either an innocent passerby or you know more than you're letting on. So therefore, they really had to focus a lot of attention on George. Now, this wasn't to accuse him of anything. It was simply that he could hold the key to finding out exactly what happened to this poor lady. Sharon was not physically strong. She walked with a cane, and she was described by some people as being quite frail. So why would someone have to go to all the lengths of tying her up so tightly to strangle her? This seemed to be someone who just wanted Sharon dead and just wanted her out of the way and didn't want to spend a lot of time doing it or a lot of bother doing it. So this case just got weirder and weirder for the police. There was no sexual motive to this murder. This clearly wasn't a burglary gone wrong. It did seem as well to be a very personal murder. She wasn't beaten. There was no sign of someone wanting to cause her prolonged physical harm. This is someone who just wanted her dead. The police took their time with George. He had just found his ex-wife dead, a woman to whom he was very, very close. He talked a lot about Sharon. He told them as much as he could about his ex-wife, and the police built up quite a bit of a rapport with George. Over the next few weeks, they spoke to him pretty much every day for several hours. The police often do this with any of their witnesses. It's not that they suspect them, they just like to keep them talking, because sometimes if you start talking about things not to do with the murder or something else, you may reveal something either about yourself or about the victim, or potentially you may even know who the perpetrator is, which may give the police that little clue that they're looking for. George spoke a bit about himself. He told them that he was a failed businessman. He tried to get so many business ventures from around the world off the ground, and they'd never really taken off. And it turned out that he was in quite a bit of debt. In his interview, he said it was approaching 100 grand, but I have read some other sources that it was more like 150 grand or more. About a week after Sharon's murder, the police asked Graham if he knew if Sharon had any life insurance. George seemed to just suddenly remember, oh yeah, she does have life insurance, and there's a will somewhere in the house. And when the police asked who the beneficiary of her life insurance and will was going to be, he revealed something that really made the police's antennae twitch. Everything was left to him. Either Sharon had taken out the life insurance after their divorce and named him, or he'd always been on her life insurance and she'd never bothered removing him. Her life insurance policy was worth £75,000. Her home would have been worth approximately £400,000. George's revelation was a huge turning point in the investigation. This was a seemingly motiveless murder, a senseless murder, but here was a man with the means and opportunity as well as a motive. However, a motive is not enough to arrest somebody. A motive does not equal intent and does not mean that you did something to somebody just because you had a reason to. There may have been somebody else with another motive, but so far it wasn't looking likely. Returning to the matter of the time of death, the police were looking through all the CCTV footage about her day in Guildford shopping that day. The last piece of the puzzle was actually found during Sharon's autopsy. Remember, as I said, her wrists were very tightly bound with parcel tape, and her hands were actually moved right up to her chin. But when the tape was removed and her body was examined, it turned out that she had a fragment of a postage stamp clasped in her hand. Police were able to find that the piece of correspondence from where this postage stamp was a letter delivered on that day of the 4th of December. Therefore, it was likely that Sharon was killed pretty much as soon as she came home. She had put her coat on the hook behind the door, she'd put her shopping to one side, and she would have picked up her mail, and then just as she was about to tear the postage stamp off, the police believe that somebody at that point hit her on the head. But what time had Sharon actually come home that day? CCTV footage was captured, and it was found that she was seen in Leatherhead about 11:15 that morning. She was also seen in the Ashstead Library about 4:45 that evening. One of the people who lived in Harriet's Lane, where Sharon lived, reported that they saw her get off the bus walking towards her property at approximately 5:30 that day. Therefore, it would have been around just maybe slightly after 5:30 that she actually went into her property, so she was probably killed within just about half an hour of her being at that house. The forensics team as well deduced that whoever it was that killed Sharon, now bear in mind they would have had to have moved her body from where she was standing not far away from her door to the bedroom. They would have had to have really tightly bound her up, and there was a lot of tape used. It wasn't just a few rounds, a huge amount of tape was used. And then the whole thing about getting the electrical cord round her, the physical act of actually strangling her, and then piling all the clothes on top of her, and they would have had to have done it as quickly as possible. This would have been a huge amount of physical force. So whoever did it, not only would they have had to have been very, very strong, but they may well have been sweating. They couldn't find any fingerprints to whoever it was. They did wear gloves, so they took care of that. But sweat can yield DNA. So the tape and Sharon's clothing, the bedding, the electrical cord, everything was tested for sweat. And sure enough, on the tape, they did find sweat. DNA was lifted from the sweat and ran through the database, but there were no matches. All they knew was that the DNA belonged to a man. As I said, the police were quite suspicious of George, and his DNA was tested against this sweat, but it wasn't a match. The police were actually a bit confused because George was the only one who had a motive to kill Sharon, but at the same time, that doesn't rule anyone else out. So they had to go back to ground zero to find out what was going on. The police were still very suspicious of him, not just because of his motive, but the way he was behaving in his interviews. As the police built up this rapport with him, they began to see what his tell was. Another thing is that he had a very close relationship with his ex-wife. When what would have been the reason? He never got back with her. She wanted him back, but he didn't go back with her. He wasn't interested in her. yet they were still so very close. He was the sole beneficiary of her will and life insurance. For what other reason would he stay close to her? They had no children together. A lot of the time when suspects or witnesses are being interviewed, they are also filmed, and the police often watch the filming back because they often look at things like body language, not just to see if somebody may be lying, but also to see someone's baseline, to see if there was any particular question that may have thrown them unexpectedly. And even though that type of analysis is not admissible in court, it can't be used as evidence, it still gives the police a little bit of information that they can go on. George's body language seemed to change a lot in his interview. Sometimes he was sitting forward, looking the interviewer in the eye, and sometimes he would sit right back and have his hand on his head or over his mouth. And he often would recite his answers before turning to the interviewer and then giving the answer. He seemed to struggle remembering certain things around Sharon's date of death, and the other things he seemed to be perfectly fine remembering things. His memory was very selective. Despite the police having these suspicions, they couldn't start being aggressive with George. They had to keep the conversations friendly, because if they gave George any indication that they were suspecting him, it would have put him on the defensive more, and he could have declined to speak to the police because he wasn't obliged to. He was doing this voluntarily. Despite the DNA not being a match for George, they still needed to know what his movements were on the day that Sharon died. George said that he'd actually been to a place called the Ashley Centre Christmas shopping, or he said he was looking in windows just for looking for things for Christmas. The police, of course, were able to secure CCTV because shopping centres have lots of CCTV. And sure enough, from around 3:30 to around 6 o'clock, George is seen at the Ashley Centre. The Ashley Centre was around 4 miles away from Sharon's house. So potentially he could have gone in a car, driven back, in no time, and may have potentially committed this murder. But the police were absolutely sure that Sharon, being the person who was meticulous as she was, as soon as she came in, she would have put her coat on the back of the door. The shopping had not been unpacked, and she would have done that quite quickly. She had just opened a piece of mail and the postage stamp was still in her hand. So she must have been incapacitated within moments of her coming through her front door, which they are sure was around 5:30. George was therefore ruled out, and this was just so frustrating for police. They had to go back to ground zero. They had to work from the bottom up again and say, look, we don't know what's going on here. They needed to rethink this in a very, very different way. No matter how suspicious somebody comes across in their interviews, no matter how much you think that they must have done it because they're the only one with a motive, it is second to none to forensic evidence. If you're seen on CCTV footage at a time that something else was happening somewhere else, you couldn't have been there. You just couldn't. And DNA, it wasn't George's. DCI Maria Woodall had another look at the case, and she didn't want to discount George straight away. She had another look at the CCTV. She watched it and she watched it and she watched it. There was something about the footage which seemed really strange to her. This was coming up to Christmas. Now, window shopping isn't anything new. We've all done it. We've all been down to the town or whatever and just looked, not really bought anything. But this was coming up to Christmas, and George was at the shopping centre for about 2.5 to 3 hours, and he made no purchases. He didn't buy any presents, he didn't buy any wrapping paper, cards, nothing. This alibi just seemed very convenient. It happened to be at the time that his ex-wife was being killed. It seemed that he just wanted to be shown on CCTV to show that he couldn't have done it. But if he didn't buy anything, why else was he going to be there? He would have had to have made another trip if he was looking for things to buy to go and buy them. Was it possible that George either knew who had killed Sharon? The police had to keep questioning George. That's the only thing they could do. And one of the things they did with him, which they said was to corroborate more things about his alibi is they checked his mobile phone records. They were particularly interested in the call history because there was something that just didn't seem right. A few weeks before Sharon was killed, a new number who had not previously called George's mobile started making lots and lots of calls, and then George was making lots and lots of calls to them. It was lots. It was just a sudden torrent of calls. And then as soon as the murder was committed, no calls at all to or from that number. Very, very suspicious. The police really wanted to know about this, but they couldn't confront George because he wasn't a suspect. They needed him to be open with them. They didn't want him to be put on the defensive because he could have refused to speak at any time. And even if they had arrested him, he had the right to remain silent. So they kept him talking. The police reeled off the numbers that they could find on the phone and asked who they were. And eventually they introduced this suspicious number. George then said something that again turned the whole investigation on its head. This number was questioned approximately 2 weeks after Sharon's murder. He then mentioned that 2 people have visited him from Thailand, and one of them had stayed with him within about a week prior to Sharon's murder. Not only was that in itself suspicious, but George had not mentioned this before. He had been very, very forthcoming. He'd seen the police almost every day. He'd answered so many questions. He'd talked and talked and talked, but he had not told them about this friend, and he had not told them about these frequent contacts before. That particular number was for someone who George identified as someone called Paul. But when the police said, "Paul who?" George didn't know this man's surname. Another red flag was that this man called Paul had actually stayed for a week at George's house that he shared with his mum. Why would you allow someone to stay with you, but you don't know their surname? That sounded extremely suspicious. George did say that he could find it out, but he never actually did. George also described him as a friend of a friend. A friend of a friend, would they stay with you or would they stay with that friend? Again, really, really suspicious. Paul had arrived in the UK at Heathrow Airport at around the 26th of November, and it was on the 29th of November that he actually travelled to George's home in Epsom. More CCTV was checked, and George's mother was seen greeting a man at the local train station on the 29th of November, and they actually greeted each other very, very close to the camera. They were able to get a good look at this man, but unfortunately, unless you've got something to go on, you can't really say who this person is. George was not giving up any more information about Paul, and when the police were saying, "What did you and Paul do together while you were here?" for some reason, even though it had only been a couple of weeks since, and someone travelling halfway around the world to see you and stay with you, and if you spend time together, it's not something you forget very quickly. George was thinking out loud, saying, "We went somewhere. We did this, I can't be sure." He wasn't sure about what he and his friend had done. And then when he was thinking, as soon as he had an answer, he then turned to the police officer to give that answer, which is exactly what he had been doing in the interviews prior to that. DCI Maria Woodall obtained permission from George to go into his house and conduct a thorough search. The room in which Paul had stayed had an ensuite. They actually found a tumbler glass, which had been left on the sink in that ensuite bathroom, and it clearly had been there for quite some time. It looked a little bit sticky, it looked used. They were pretty sure that this was a glass that had been used by Paul. It was tested and a fingerprint was found. Fingerprint was ran through the database and it matched to a man called Paul Crine, who in the 1970s had been convicted for armed robbery and holding a girlfriend hostage, and it was the latter crime for which he served 7 years. Back in the 1970s, DNA testing had not made its way into investigations, so fingerprints were kept, and fingerprint databases were updated regularly. Historical records were put into newer records. Paul Crine was an expat living in Thailand, and he was 61 years old at the time of Sharon's murder. As well as being a convicted criminal in the UK, his behaviour in Thailand, in Pattaya in particular, was very, very suspicious because he actually had been on trial in Thailand for murder. A man called Robert Henry, who was originally from Coventry in the UK, had also emigrated to Thailand. He was apparently abducted and then his body was found 6 days later in a canal. His cause of death was gunshot wounds to the neck and the head. Paul was arrested and put on trial, but the only reason he was not convicted was because the prosecution witnesses failed to turn up to give evidence. Therefore, Paul was cleared of murder. However, that doesn't mean he didn't do it. It just means there was a lack of evidence. The police knew who Paul Crine was. The problem was linking him to Sharon to find out why was very, very difficult. George was the link between these two people, Paul Crine and Sharon Birchwood, because Paul didn't know Sharon and Sharon didn't know Paul. There was no connection between the two of them at all. A very, very covert mission was set up. It was very need to know. DCI Maria Woodall had to arrange for this to happen, but she had to make sure that everybody under her investigation were only in the know if they had to be in the know, and consulted with a man called Barry Kenyon. Paul Crine was tracked down to a place called Pattaya in Thailand. It's well known for being a place for expats. It also is well known for having a lot of criminal activity. Barry Kenyon was able to contact Paul, and he actually arranged to have a lunch meeting with him. The reason this was so covert is that they didn't even want Paul Crine to know that the police were even in Thailand. He could have skipped town. He could have tampered with evidence. Barry and Paul had a lunch in an open area cafe, and after the meeting finished, Barry stayed behind and he seized Paul's cutlery and the remains of what Paul was actually eating. These items were sent to the UK, they were tested, and Paul Crine's DNA was lifted. Paul's DNA was ran against the DNA found at the crime scene, and they were a perfect match. This was confirmation that Paul had killed Sharon. The problem was, why would Paul want to kill Sharon? Why did he come over from halfway around the world to kill this woman? He had no reason to. There was no motive. But there was one common denominator: George Birchwood. Did George arrange for Paul to kill Sharon? Was this a hit? Sharon's home was still being searched because there was so much more to go through, and it turned out that she wrote a lot of her feelings down on loose pieces of paper which were found all over the house. She would write about George, and one of these writings was very, very suspicious. It said, "Are you hoping that I am going to die so you can use the insurance money to sort out your mess?" With this information, George Birchwood was arrested. Now, when you're a suspect, you do have the right to legal representation, you have the right to remain silent, but George was still quite happy to talk, yet he wasn't quite as forthcoming as he was previously. He was extremely defensive. He got very, very belligerent at one point, where he said he didn't want to continue a line of questioning because it upset him, but this was questions purely about Sharon's murder. He didn't want to answer these questions. George strenuously denied ever having anything to do with Sharon's murder. He also denied that this very suspicious jotting that the police found that they actually thrust under his nose and said, "What about this?" He tried to twist as much of that around as possible. Any of Sharon's words about him wanting her out of the way or only being with her for the money, he would twist that around and say, no, it doesn't say that whatsoever. Finally, when George's email records were reviewed, this was confirmation that George had arranged for Paul Crine to kill Sharon Birchwood. An email which was written around 6 months before Sharon was killed, in which George had addressed Paul as Paul Crine. Remember, beforehand, apparently he didn't know his surname. This email confirmed that there was an arrangement in place, which would mean that Paul would gain £30,000 as soon as George got his life insurance money from Sharon's death. So Paul Crine came to the UK to kill Sharon for £30,000. I mean, killing anyone for any reason whatsoever is just disgusting. For £30,000, he came all the way over to the UK, killed someone, then went back. and carried on life as if nothing had ever happened. This was the one piece of evidence that George had no answer for. He still denied anything to do with it, but he still could not explain this email. Paul Crime was also arrested and extradited to the UK. Even though George was not the one to actually kill Sharon, he pretty much was a murderer because he was the one who arranged it. If you arrange to have someone killed, you are a murderer. Both men were found guilty of murder and were sentenced to a minimum of 32 years before being considered for parole. The judge was heard to say to George, "This was carefully planned in the most dreadful circumstances. Clearly you are a very dangerous man who all along has tried to evade his responsibility. You have shown no remorse whatsoever. There are no mitigating features. This was a murder committed with the expectation of gain." At Paul's trial, the judge said this, "You may well spend the rest of your life behind bars. If you do, I'm afraid that will be the consequences of your own actions. Sharon was murdered in a particularly unpleasant and personal way in what should have been the safety and security of her own home. One can only imagine the mental and physical suffering she must have undergone in the last few minutes of her life while you tightened the electrical cable around her neck until she was dead." The judge also described what happened to Sharon as an execution. It wasn't someone who had a personal vendetta against Sharon, it was someone who just wanted to get the job done. Sharon was very vulnerable and she was very loving. She loved George. This was a man to whom she'd been married. She'd known him for over 30 years and he arranged to have her killed. One thing that was very, very chilling was that when Paul was first mentioned during George's previous interviews with police, he mentioned that the Friday before the Tuesday on which Sharon had been killed, he'd gone to visit Sharon and taken Paul with him. Paul had visited Sharon in her home on that day. Imagine 4 days after meeting somebody, you go and kill them. You don't know this person, and the person who's brokering this transaction has just introduced you to them. Like, you see them as a live being, and then you're going to go and kill them. That is just abhorrent. It really, really is. One more thing I found out when I was looking at this case is that when George was on trial, he complained about how he was treated by the police the very day that Sharon was found dead. Now, I've got my notes about this. He was treated just as a witness, but he complained that he'd been left in the police car for half an hour on his own as soon as the police arrived. He was very upset about what had happened to Sharon. Now, we know that he arranged for this murder. He said he was so upset about it that he was not happy at being left on his own. At first he said it was half an hour, then he changed it to an hour. He said it was the worst hour of his life, and he said some quite horrible things about the police in charge of that investigation for putting him through that. What about what Sharon had gone through? What about what her family were going through? Seriously, neither Paul Crine nor George Birchwood ever admitted their part in the murder. They both protested their innocence all the time they were serving their sentences. Both Paul and George have since passed away in prison in February 2018 and September 2019 respectively. I wanted to cover this case because this is a very, very good example where the police do everything right. They interview everybody. They give out leaflets. They welcome all kinds of information. They look through CCTV. They look for DNA. They look for fingerprinting. They go to right round the whole globe to find somebody and get their DNA. DCI Maria Woodall, again, she also solved the disappearance of Millie Dowler, which was very, very difficult. I may cover that case, but just to give a bit of information about that, is that also relied on some CCTV footage, which had to be cleared up and reviewed by a company, I think some forensic team in America, just to find out exactly what had happened on the street where that camera footage was taken. It was so difficult to pinpoint exactly when Millie went missing, where she went missing, and therefore who had the opportunity, and finding this person who was eventually convicted of her murder was very hard, but it was done. And DCI Maria Woodall headed up that investigation. During true crime research for this channel, but also just generally, there are so many cases that I've seen where life insurance policies have been the motive of murder. Now, I'm not saying don't ever get a life insurance policy because they can be really, really good. But what I would say is be very careful who you name as a beneficiary. If you split up with somebody, have them removed. Please, please protect people. Please protect people and protect yourself. Seriously. And really think about who your beneficiaries are of your life insurance or assurance or will or anything like that. If you have any case requests, please let me know in the comments below, or tweet me or go into my Facebook page and I will put the links up above. And I really hope you're all well and happy wherever you are. Please research this case. It is really quite fascinating, and I will see you all very soon. Thank you. Goodbye.